Dr. Michael Mohammed Ahmad is the founding director of the Sweatshop literacy movement and author of 3 award-winning semi-autobiographical novels. This is part 2 of his conversation with Professor Jing Han from the Institute for Australian and Chinese Arts and Culture at Western Sydney University.
You are obviously very well read and educated in Western and English literatures. And you're also fluent in Arabic, in writing and reading. When it comes to your own creative writing, what traditions, influences did you draw on?
With regards to the Western literary canon, you know, growing up in a settler colonial society, it's unfortunate that it's oversaturated, that we in high school and in university will overwhelmingly be asked to study white literature. I say it's unfortunate because it's led to a little bit of a rebellion. Because we've been asked to consume this level of whiteness, we now kind of want to shrug it all off as part of our civil rights struggle. I try to find a balance insofar as it's not about rejecting the European canon. It's still important to know it and to learn it and to appreciate it, whilst also making room for the other amazing literary traditions that have been created throughout the world. So I do have, as you pointed out, an appreciation for the Western canon. In my books, they are incredibly and deeply influenced by the writings of authors such as Nabokov and James Joyce, and even Shakespeare, and writers like Mary Wollstonecraft and Mary Shelley and Jane Austen. A really good example of how influence runs through me is if we talked about a text like Lolita. Lolita is an incredibly complex text for me because it's the story of a predator, of a sexual predator and a pedophile who preys on a young girl. It's not a love story, and anyone who thinks it is, I think, has misinterpreted the text. It's quite a vile story. It's quite a horrible experience to read about what Humbert does to this little girl. But at the same time, it's one of the most beautifully written texts to ever come out of the Western canon, in my opinion. The poetry and the language that's used to express his obsession with this girl is stunning. The line, "the rest is rust and stardust," you know, the assonance and the alliteration and the rhythm that's built into that line, for example. So this gives you quite a contradictory experience as a reader. On the one hand, you're disgusted by the actions and the behavior, and on the other hand, you're moved and inspired by the beauty of the language. And similarly, you know, when you're writing about teenage boys, especially underclass young men who are growing up in a very patriarchal, sexist and misogynistic and homophobic context, the language and the behavior is incredibly vulgar. And at the same time, I'd like to think that the narrator, my narrator, Bani, is, because he's such a romantic and because he's so educated in the canon, he's also layering all that vulgarity with poetry. And so I took that inspiration from Nabokov in the way I told my stories of trying to create that contradictory experience in a reader, the contrast between disgust and beauty. One of the goals I set my writers when I'm mentoring young writers at Sweatshop is that they should try and create a text where every single line is an original contribution to knowledge. That's an insane standard to set, and it's an insane goal to set. It's not a realistic goal, but I think it's a goal to work towards. That's what you should try to do. That you should try and avoid any of your lines being cliches. And as more and more literature is developed throughout the world, and as the contributions to knowledge increase every day, that becomes a harder task for writers to achieve. But one of my greatest inspirations for this goal is Shakespeare, actually. Because I think Shakespeare is both overrated and underrated. He's overrated because he's just everywhere, in every course, every curriculum, every school, every university. Overrated in that sense, but underrated in that we tend to forget how brilliant he genuinely was, because we probably all feel a little bit exhausted. We all have a little bit of Shakespeare fatigue, that we kind of forget the magic. But when you go back to Shakespeare and you just read him outside of all the hype, you really appreciate the idea that he might have been one of the only writers in human history that actually could achieve that goal, where every single line he wrote was a quotable quote and was an original contribution. So I want to stress my passion and my love for the European canon. But I don't have a hatred for it, but I've had to reject it in many ways. In Australia, my priority has always been to focus on First Nations writers. The wonderful Melissa Lukashenko, who I understand you translated, her book Too Much Lip, it actually came out at the same time as the Lebs. So her and I had the honor of being shortlisted for several awards at the same time. She won the Miles Franklin the year that I was shortlisted. I won the Multicultural Prize the year that she was shortlisted. So we got to share that journey together of having our books out. So writers like Melissa Lukashenko, who wrote Too Much Lip, but also Alexis Wright, whose books have actually been translated into Mandarin by the same translator that has translated my books, Professor Lee Yawa. I would say in Australia, when we're talking about somebody like Alexis Wright, that goal that I set, every line needs to be an original contribution to knowledge. Europe has Shakespeare, Australia has Alexis Wright. And I would say that what's amazing about her work is that you can basically open up her books to anywhere, any page at any moment in time, and read any line, and it would be an original contribution to knowledge.
I love your answers. Really, really good. And now let's talk about your first book, The Tribe. And this tells us 3 stories of the life and the customs, as well as conflicts of a minority group, Arabic Muslims, Eloise, in Australia. Told by a young boy, as you mentioned, Benny Adam, through his 7, 9, and 11 years eyes. The stories are told in such a illuminating and lyrical language. It's so poetic. It's just a pure joy reading the story. You wrote this book, as you mentioned before, like in response to decades of negative stereotypes. So the book challenges the reader, but also lead the reader to understand a world that is very different from theirs. My question is, why do you choose a young boy, Benny Adam, as the narrator?
Thank you for that question and that kind interpretation of my work. In all 3 books, there's 2 narrators operating simultaneously. It's subtle. It's not done through explicitly being told. I don't tell the reader that this is happening, but it's done through tense. There's an older Benny Adam who is narrating the story, and he has a kind of more introspective and reflective capacity. Because he's older, he's more intelligent, he's more experienced, he's more aware, and he also has retrospective knowledge. And then there's the child narrator, the young narrator, who's experiencing what's taking place in the moment. And that's usually happening in the present tense. So the older narrator usually speaks in the past tense, and the young narrator speaks in the present tense. And these go back and forth, and they happen interchangeably. You can actually see it if you're reading closely. You can actually see it even on the first lines of the 3 parts of the tribe. He starts by saying, I was only 7 when this happened, but it always feels like right now. So you can already see my experimentation. I don't know if I do it well, but I would say that I'm experimenting. I'm trying to do it well. My experimentation with the 2 tenses working simultaneously. And I think it's very important that's recognized. And I'll tell you why. Because a lot of readers of the work say sometimes the little boy sounds more mature and older than he actually is. And it's because they're missing the way the tense is working. And this is why I think creative writing needs to be understood as a skill, and creative reading needs to be understood as a skill. It's something you can learn to do. But the reason why I felt like we needed a child narrator, there's two answers that I have for that. The first one is a technical answer. I wanted to go through my life. These are 3 books that look at 3 aspects of the life of an Arab Muslim man. The first being the experience of childhood. The second, which is the Lebs, being the experience of teenagehood. And the third, which is the other half of you, being the experience of adulthood, early adulthood. And so when I started writing The Tribe as the first book, it was a very organic instinct to just go to the beginning and to just recount in a creative way my childhood. So just as a kind of technical exercise, the 3 books gradually evolved to show my full life. They just naturally followed on from one another in that capacity. And what I love about the accidental creation of the books and the accidental packaging of the books is you can almost see the books growing up as I grow up and as my autobiographical alter ego grows up, because The Tribe is quite small, and then the Lebs is a little bit bigger, and then the other half of you is commercial paperback edition, So I got bigger, the books got bigger, Banny got bigger as all 3 of us grew up.
I love that concept, because that's actually my later question, but now you answered it, because I did notice that the books, 3 books, as they're getting bigger and thicker, as the age of the narrator.
Also, as I'm getting better as a writer, and as I'm growing as a writer and becoming more ambitious and becoming more competent and capable of managing more words. And I think this is often unappreciated in the way we teach creative writing. Like the amount of times I meet somebody who comes up to me and says, I've written a novel. And I'm like, I think you should learn how to write a sentence before you learn how to write a novel, And so there's a kind of gradual growing up and growth that's taking place for me. My evolution as a writer is on full display with the 3 books. So that's the technical answer. But there's also another point on the idea of writing, starting off from the point of view of a child, is the innocence of a child, seeing things in a way that aren't corrupted by awareness. The more you know, the darker the world can tend to be. And I wanted to show a kind of beauty, and wonder that tends to come through in the way a child experiences the world.
That's so true. To point it that in this next question is actually related to two narrative voices, as Benny Adams as in the moment, and also reflection as in older Adam, the young Adam at the point in school, Alexandra Public Primary School, and his white friend says that you are a lab. You should go back to where you came from. And Adam said, I'm not lab. And then the boy said, you are sent N-word. And then Adam said, I'm not black. So in another place, and then Adam, in the eye of older Adam, and he reflects, he said, it terrifies me to realize that I'm not white, or even worse, not the opposite of white, to be able to say what I am. So do you think being Arab Muslim Australians, neither white nor black nor Asian, add another layer of complexities in finding your identity in this multiracial, multicultural society?
Thank you so much for that question. I find that to be a very deep and profound question. And there's 2 sides to it. On the one hand, it's really important that minorities build solidarity with each other in the face of ongoing white supremacist ideology. And I think it's important that in some ways we are able to strip away aspects of who we are in order to come together for a greater struggle. So, for example, the way Australians came together after the Christchurch massacre, in which 51 Muslims peacefully conducting their Friday prayers were slaughtered by an Australian-born white supremacist. It really mattered to us, to me as an Australian Muslim, that it wasn't just experienced, the pain wasn't just experienced by the Muslim community, that it was a shared pain that many Australians, Muslim and non-Muslims, feel in response to white supremacy. So in some ways, there is a real importance of a shared solidarity among minorities that I believe is able to transcend the specifics of our cultural backgrounds, and that is necessary to confront one of the most toxic forms of racism in the history of the world, which is white supremacy.
Let's talk about your latest, the third book, The Other Half of You. And the story, despite all the conflicts, including Benny Adams' inner conflicts, doesn't end in a tragic, like classic Romeo and Juliet, but on a very positive note, that in the end, Benny's family has accepted his white wife as an outsider, and even Benny's father, who had been a patriarchal figure, staunchly defending traditions of the tribe, and is now seen to go through radical transformation. Where do you think this positive and progressive force comes from? Ultimate humanity, or social progress, education, or something else? Are you optimistic about the future of Australia as an increasingly more diverse and mixed nation?
I'll answer the two questions. The first one is, where does it come from? You know, there was an incredibly racist cartoon that was drawn by a cartoonist for The Australian named Bill Leake several years ago, in which an Indigenous father didn't recognize his son. Most Australians would have heard about that. It was in the media. It made a lot of noise because of the dehumanization and the humiliation of Indigenous men, specifically Indigenous fathers, that cartoon propagated. But what a lot of Australians don't realize is that Bill Leake had been doing those kinds of cartoons for a long time, for other men of color as well. Before that cartoon, he'd actually drawn one in which a Palestinian father was throwing their child into a war zone and saying, "Go and win daddy's propaganda war for him." In the case of both the portrayal of First Nations fathers and the portrayal of Arab and Muslim fathers, and more broadly, the portrayal of fathers of color, this fantasy that white people have the capacity to love our children more than we have the capacity to love our own children. So when I wrote The Other Half of You, I really wanted to tell a story about the beauty of fatherhood among men from Arab, Muslim backgrounds, and more broadly, the backgrounds of men of color. Because I wanted to reclaim something that had been taken away from us, our love for our children. I wanted to tell a story that emphasized our capacity for love and the deepness of that love as a political act in a time when we are regularly told that our love is less and is lacking. Am I more optimistic? You know, one of my mentors, I won't name the person, but one of my mentors, when I was first starting off as a very fiery, very angry, young Arab man, said something really interesting to me. I remember he said to me, "Calm down. I promise things will change. I promise things will get better." I often reflect on that statement for two reasons. Firstly, because he was part right, and secondly, because he was part wrong. He was right on one part of that statement, and he was wrong on the other part. He was right that things were going to change and things were going to get better. They have, in fact. There's been a tremendous amount of change in arts in the West in general, and there's been a much stronger focus on diversity. But where he was wrong was to tell me to calm down. Because this assumes, to tell me to calm down assumes that change happens in a vacuum. Calm down, shut up, know your place, things will change. It's a paradox. Things change because we're not calm. Things change because we are putting tremendous pressure on the industry to change. This famous Malcolm X saying, it's the squeaky tire that gets the grease. And so I am optimistic, but I'm not optimistic insofar as saying, job's done, let's not worry anymore. I'm optimistic in that the momentum is behind us to keep going.
So true. So faith in action and faith in educating younger generation or empowering them. Critical thinking, as you keep saying, it is critical. Thank you so much, Mohammed. It is such a pleasure and honor and a privilege to have this conversation.
And I would also like to say thank you and shukran, which is how we say thank you in Arabic, and also salamu alaikum, which means peace be upon you.
Thank you.